Hi, I'm Jason Harman. I'm going to be talking about financial ratios. So there are 4 different types of financial ratios. There's activity analysis, liquidity analysis, solvency analysis, and then profitability analysis. So some of their purposes and limitations, there's 2 main purposes, and that's to identify the relationship between risk and return among firms of different sizes, to provide further analyses on a firm's economic characteristics, strategies, and the associated operating, investing, and financial activities. That's the second main purpose. And then there are 5 limitations. The first one being the ratios may be deceptive due to a difference in industries, capital structures, and accounting methods. Luckily, for what we're comparing, they're pretty similar. Number 2 is proportionality assumption on the numerator and denominator. The third being hard to select an appropriate benchmark. You know, different companies have different goals, and so one company might be happy with one ratio and another might be happy with a different ratio. And then number 4 is timing and possible window dressing. For example, if there's ratios greater than 1, reducing both the numerator and the denominator by the same amount may improve the ratio, while if the ratio is less than 1, adding the same amount to both the numerator and denominator. And then number 5 is negative numbers. So the first one we're going to be talking about is activity analysis. So these are ratios that are categories of financial ratios that measure a firm's ability to convert different accounts within its balance sheets into cash or sales. Activity ratios measure the relative efficiency of a firm based on its use of assets, leverage, or other similar balance sheet items, and are more important in determining whether a company's management is doing a good enough job of generating revenues and cash from its resources. And then so the couple types of ratios that fall under activity analysis are accounts receivable turnover, inventory turnover, accounts payable turnover, working capital turnover, and total asset turnover. The one that we're going to be focusing on today is working capital turnover. And you calculate that by finding the sales divided by average working capital. And for this ratio, a higher working capital turnover means more efficiency. And as we can see here, Google has a higher ratio in every year, but the 2 are pretty close. And but from this ratio, we can see that Google's running more efficient. And then on this graph over here, we have Google in red and Facebook in blue. And as I just said, we can see that Google is higher in each year. So the next one is liquidity analysis. It's used to determine a debtor's ability to pay off its current debt obligations without raising external capital. Liquidity ratios measure a company's ability to pay debt obligations and its margin of safety through the calculation of metrics. So for these ratios, there's current ratio, quick ratio, cash ratio, working capital ratio, operating cycle, cash cycle, and defensive interval. The one we're going to be focusing on is current ratio. So we calculate that by finding the current assets divided by current liabilities. So the higher the current ratio, the better, because it means that the company's liquidity is efficient and they can meet their current obligations without raising more external capital and by using their liquid assets. As we can see here, Facebook has basically doubled Google in almost every year. And so for this current ratio, we would give Facebook the edge. And then as we're looking at the graph here, once again, Facebook is in blue and Google is in red. And as you can see, Facebook has a huge advantage in this current ratio. So the next analysis will be solvency. So solvency ratios are primarily used to measure a company's ability to meet its long-term obligations. So in general, a solvency ratio measures the size of a company's profitability and compares it to its obligations or debts. By determining a solvency ratio, an analyst or an investor can gain insight into how likely a company will be able to continue to meet their debt obligations, and a stronger or higher ratio indicates financial strength. So for these ratios, we have debt ratio, equity ratio, debt to equity ratio, liabilities to equity ratio, and the interest coverage ratio. The one we're going to be focusing on is debt to equity ratio, and we find that by calculating the total debts divided by total equity. And a company wants to have a lower debt to equity ratio. And a very interesting thing here, Facebook is at 0 from 2016 to 2018. And that basically is showing that it's pretty cool that Facebook doesn't have any long-term debts at all, so that's really good for if you're investing in the company. But even in 2014 and 2015, they have extremely low debt to equity ratio. And then Google is still very, very low on its own end, which is a good sign for Google too, but Facebook gets this edge. And then looking at this graph, as you can see, Facebook barely is even showing up, and these are kind of skewed a little bit because Google is extremely low, but it looks so much higher just because of the comparison. The next one that we're going to be focusing on is profitability analysis, and these ratios are a class of financial metrics that are used to assess a business's ability to generate earnings relative to its revenue, operating costs, balance sheets, and shareholders' equity over time using data from a specific point in time. So some of these ratios are gross profit margin, operating profit margin, return on assets, return on sales, return on invested capital, and return on equity. The one, however, that we're going to be focusing on is return on equity. So we calculate that by the net income divided by average stockholders' equity. And so for this one, a company wants to have a higher return on equity ratio because it means that they don't have to raise as much capital to generate their profits. And as we can see here, Facebook gets the edge in 2016, 2017, and 2018, which is the most recent year, so that's a good sign for Facebook. And Google's been kind of up and down on this ratio, but they did have a higher ratio in 2014 and in 2015. And now looking at this graph, as you can see, Facebook has been climbing up on the return on equity, so that's a really good sign. And then Google has been just kind of up and down, kind of a little volatile, as we would say. And that's it.